Yeah, I don't know if you saw the movie The Big Short with Christian Bale, Steve Carell. You had a whole bunch of big name actors. Ryan Gosling was
I'm
in it.
fam- I'm familiar with it, but I never actually got to see it.
Oh, it's a fantastic movie. If you haven't seen it, you have to see it. And it's largely based on the life of this guy, Dr. Michael J. Burry, who was a doctor who I think he inherited about $100,000 to get started. He invested that money, did fantastically well. And so pretty soon he's being hired by big time people with a lot of money, but who aren't necessarily good at playing the stock market. They hired him to manage their finances. And then he made some bets on the stock market and specifically the housing market. So it wasn't really stocks. He was betting on the housing market that it was going to crash back in 2008. And that's the big short, right? He took a short position in housing when almost everybody else said housing is going to go up forever. Well, he has another explosive prediction, which is that he thinks that these lockdowns are causing more damage than they're preventing, that the economic damage actually outweighs the medical benefits. And we've heard this from a lot of people, but I think this gets a little bit more attention because he's actually a doctor. He is an actual doctor. And so here's what he says: COVID, like all coronaviruses, will not easily engender durable herd immunity, and vaccines will prove elusive. We must learn to live with it, which I think you and I have, I don't know if we've said it in quite those terms, but essentially that's what an exit strategy has to look like is we have to learn how to cope with the coronavirus. We can't we cannot just bury our heads in the sand and say, okay, we're going to wait this out for the next year and a half. We cannot bring the economy to a standstill for a year and a half. And so he says, and he's a bit more extreme on this than I am, but he says, which means universal treatment with available drugs and no hysteria, i.e., no lockdown. That's from his Twitter feed. And he's also been a fan. Again, he's a doctor. He's been an advocate of using chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine to treat those who are infected, which is very controversial. There's a lot of people out there saying it's too dangerous, that it can cause heart attacks, which it very well might. And I do think that we need to do more research, but at the same time, there has to be right to try. If you're sick and this is your only hope, what do you have to lose? I,
This
I, Mhm.
this issue, Pete, reminds me of a documentary I watched years ago, and I wish I could actually recall the name of the documentary, but it was about the Ebola outbreak in Western. I'm sorry, yes, in Western Africa, like the Liberia, that area. They had a huge outbreak of Ebola within recent memory, and I watched a really good documentary years ago about it. And one of the things that came out of it that was interesting was near the end of the outbreak, which by the way, they didn't know was the end of the outbreak, but what turned out to be the end of the outbreak, the doctors on the ground got desperate. And what they did was they took people that had actually overcome Ebola. In other words, people that had developed an immunity to Ebola and survived it. In other words, they had either had an immunity to begin with, or they actually survived the infection and had antibodies. And what they did was they took these people, they took blood transfusions from them, and they took these blood transfusions and they put them in sick people. And I remember part of the documentary said that the international community, which I don't know if the WHO specifically, because it was a while ago that I saw this, but basically they said the international medical community was panning them because they didn't use proper controls and this wasn't properly researched and they didn't know how effective this was. You know, what was the epidemic, because it wasn't a pandemic, was the epidemic already subsiding? But they were just desperate and they just said, you know what, we're just going to try this. And many of the people who got the blood transfusions survived. In fact, I believe a majority of them actually survived, when that was not the case with the majority of people infected with Ebola. They were dying. So it's kind of interesting to me that that gets into the whole right to try. And also that comes down to a doctor's decision with their patient about what treatments that they're willing to try, what they're willing to do, especially if they're going to die anyway.
Yeah, I don't think that we should worship the scientific method. I understand that the scientific method is in many ways the font of all material knowledge. Everything that we know about the material world, we know because of the scientific method, which is we develop a hypothesis, and then we say, okay, what would be true if that is true? And we try to falsify it. And if we can't falsify it, at some point we say, okay, we are very confident that this hypothesis, this idea is true. But we may not have years to investigate this. If you have already over 40,000 Americans have died, and you have far more who have died worldwide, we may have as many as a third of the population. That when they did a random study this week, a third of the population in a small sample had the virus, which means that the death rate, the fatality rate, is much lower probably than we thought it was. But we don't have time. That we are panicking, and that's kind of okay because this really is a serious thing. This could be much worse than we think it is. It could be far less serious than we think it is. But we don't have time to just simply wait it out, wait for the data to come in. And so to say, well, we're going to have these double blind scientific studies, the gold standard of the scientific method, that's nuts. People's lives are on the line. We can't just wait and say we're not going to treat anybody. And there's one more thing that he mentioned that I wanted to bring up before we move on to the next topic. He says the shutdown is not good for anyone. Only 30% of whites and Asians can work from home, but it's far worse for blacks and Latinos. Hard-earned job and wage gains are evaporating fastest for the already underprivileged. At what cost? Prevention. And that's something that we've also talked about on this show, that this virus is impacting the underprivileged more than the privileged. If you're able to work from home, as I largely do, and I mean, what are we doing right now? We're working from home.
Exactly.
That's a
We're
privilege.
telecommuting right now.
Yeah, we're
So
telecommuting right now. Not everybody has that privilege. If you're working at a hospital as a nurse, if you're working at a grocery store, if you're working for Instacart or Uber or whatever it is, you cannot telecommute to that job. It's just absolute. It's nuts. And there was a little bit of pushback on this article though. Um, the author of the book, The Big Short, Michael Lewis, pushed back and said that Trump was unprepared and uninterested in doing what needed to be done in the event of a crisis such as presented by COVID-19. I don't know if that's true. I will say I have read that book, The Fifth Risk, since reading this article, and it is a fascinating look into the mind of what I would say I wouldn't even call it the progressive left, but the technocratic left. It makes a very strong case for a lot of obscure government agencies. And so I would say if anything, Michael Burry is kind of coming at this from, I don't want to say a right wing perspective, but he seems to be taking sort of the MAGA Trump line here, and Michael Lewis is taking the Democrat line. Not that this is a partisan issue. One of the fascinating things about this whole COVID outbreak is that it has largely broken up and scrambled political alliances. That you have people on the right who are like, hey, we need to take this really seriously. We need to lock things down. You have people on the left saying it's all a hoax. It's all Bill Gates wants to vaccinate your kids. So